going to be introducing the talks, and moderating the panels. You should probably know who I am. I'm a journalist. I work for The Economist here in London. But as I say, you're going to have to put up with me quite a bit over the next couple of days, so I'm going to get out of your hair. Your first speaker is Amba Kak. She's a policy advisor, public policy advisor at Mozilla in Delhi. She's going to talk to you about data protection in India. The interesting thing about data protection in India, which she's going to tell you at greater length than I am, is that it's not simply a matter of consumer protection. It's also got to do with the tension between government and the tech giants. And the argument I think that she's going to make is that while most of us can get on board with reclaiming certain rights from tech giants, we may not necessarily be that comfortable with governments taking those rights and keeping them for themselves rather than distributing them to their citizens. But I'm going to stop there. Amba.
I am really happy to be here, and this is the first time I'm wearing a Britney mic, as I was told this is called. I'm going to start. I'm going to start with just asking the audience, how many people here have been following or somewhat following the debate on privacy and data protection in India? No judgment. Okay, wow, that was way more than I was expecting. But so I was thinking a little bit about what might be interesting to convey to this audience, particularly since many of you might not have the context. And I do this quite often. I'm often in spaces where I'm trying to communicate to people, mostly in Western audiences, why what's happening in India or elsewhere in the world matters. I mean, it's 2018 and I still have to do this, which is kind of sad. But for that reason, I was trying to figure out how could I explain what was going on in India as part of this more global narrative, this global moment about privacy and data protection that we're experiencing. And so the story that I had come up with started with Facebook Cambridge Analytica. It was about how in March this year, we were all, almost globally, it felt like there was this outrage, this backlash against the data practices of big technology platforms. And in that outrage was this kind of recognition that, the market for personal data wasn't going to fix itself. And therefore, it was governments that finally had to act. And we saw this in the United States, but we also saw this in Latin America, in Brazil. We saw it in Africa, in Kenya. We finally saw governments seem less reluctant, and there was not as much inertia to actually act to pass general privacy rules that would apply to these companies. So in India, the same sort of thing was happening. In fact, you saw in just a period of a year, you had the government institute a committee that was meant to draft this law. They took feedback from the public. And in less than a year, they actually came out with a draft data protection law. Well, it's a draft, so it isn't. And people are saying that it could go to Parliament as soon as this winter. So if you look at it as part of this global story, it could seem that what's happening in India is simply kind of being born into and out of this more global moment. And that's when you zoom out. But if you will bear with me for the next 10, 15 minutes, I'm going to urge you to zoom in instead. Because when you look closely at what's happening in India, what you see is a story of actually national politics, national context intersecting and interplaying with this global mood. And I'm going to explain what's happening with India's privacy law in terms of 3 developments. The first is Aadhaar, the government's national ID project. The second is the GDPR, which is Europe's General Data Protection Regulation. And finally, what I call the Indian tech clash, which is not so much a general angst against surveillance capitalism, as it is a very specific angst about the fact that Western companies are exploiting the data of Indian citizens to the exclusion of Indian companies and the Indian government. So let's start with Aadhaar. Okay, so I think, again, how many people in this room have heard something about Aadhaar? Okay, quite a few. But for those who don't, Aadhaar is the name for the government's national biometric ID project. It's a project that assigned a 12-digit number to every Indian resident, and that number was linked to key biometric demographic information, which included your fingerprints and iris scan. Now, the Aadhaar number and the biometric technology is not being used just by governments to deliver services. it was being increasingly used by all kinds of private companies, and it was being inserted into the databases of these companies. So you had banks asking for it, telecom companies asking for it, even Amazon asking for it to track lost packages. So it was kind of the Wild West, and it did something very important in India. It took the conversation about privacy, which was considered to be this issue that only affected the urban, the online, the elite, and it made it clear that this was a project, this was a technology, and this was a data-driven technology that was affecting every Indian resident, rich or poor, urban or rural. And it was not just the fact that they were actually interacting with technology for the first time, it was also the fact that this fear of surveillance, the fear of being tracked across your government, across your interactions with both government and private services, it really created a real fear of surveillance. It made it clear that data protection was not simply about protecting data, but about protecting people, and therefore it had to be a conversation that we were having and that we were having now. It also helped that a lot of the legal challenges to the Aadhaar Project were that they were violation of our right to privacy. So was a single biometric identifier that followed me across my public and private services simply creating a dossier that was available for tracking and profiling? Was the fact that the sensitive personal data of 1.2 billion Indians was in one database, was that safe? Was that secure? So it kind of kick-started this conversation, and the government of India, in its infinite wisdom, came to the Supreme Court and argued that Indians, in fact, did not have a right to privacy, because the term privacy didn't really figure in the Constitution. We couldn't find it anywhere, and so hence proved. The Supreme Court not only disagreed with them, but they, in really a judgment for the ages, they said that Indians do have a fundamental right to privacy. In fact, this right to privacy is kind of fundamental to the exercise of any other right. But they went even further. They argued that the government had to act to protect Indians from both the government and private companies and their threats to privacy. So here we are. I mean, there was clear guidance from the Supreme Court to pass a law, and now the government is moving. But what we're seeing is that there's a lot of backlash and a criticism, a main criticism to this bill, is that it isn't as tough on government as it is on private companies. And it's because this bill has really been triggered by this context that people are really unhappy about. So two things. One, the fact that this bill does not require the government to ask for consent for a large number of services. And the second, that the body that's supposed to enforce this law doesn't seem like it's sufficiently independent from the government itself. So that's the first piece of this puzzle. The second is what I think many more people might be familiar with, which is the GDPR. So on May 25th, I'm sure many of us here, and not just the Europeans, many of us non-Europeans too, must have got a lot of emails in our inbox. They were telling us that their privacy, companies were letting us know their privacy policies had changed. Maybe they were offering you the option to opt out or even delete your data. And that's because, for a lot of companies, it made sense to kind of apply their changed privacy protections globally rather than kind of localize them to Europe. But that's not the global impact that I want to actually stress on today. If you look at India's data protection bill, the draft bill that's out in the public, you'll see that a large chunk of it, and particularly the strong bits, the bits that put obligations on companies and the government, almost mirror that of the GDPR. And that itself might not be. In fact, governments borrow from each other all the time when they're formulating laws. But the interesting thing about it is that the GDPR actually provided a reason for Indian companies to advocate for strong rules. So you heard that right. Often I found unlikely allies in the Indian IT industry because they were like, we also want strong privacy rules. And if that doesn't make sense to you, I'm going to kind of explain why. One of the main reasons is that the European Commission was clear that there could be transfer of personal data between Europe and the rest of the world. No problem, it could be unrestricted. The only condition was that these countries had to have what they called adequate data protection. And they would decide when particular laws were adequate. And so for a lot of Indian IT companies, if India had strong rules, this was an opportunity to open up new markets. Currently, they were treated often with suspicion, particularly with respect to their data practices, but suddenly there was the possibility of opening up this new market. And for companies that were already global, like I mentioned, it was even more of a no-brainer, right? Because you were already providing these protections for the European market, so it wouldn't take a lot to kind of replicate that globally as long as the rules were similar. I think just a few days ago, Tim Cook announced that he thought that the GDPR was a great law, and in fact, that laws like this should be passed everywhere. And so, but the final way in which I think the GDPR has really been a trigger, has really been a trigger for the Indian data protection law is that it's been out there in the public domain for several years now, even though it was enforced only in May. And so for not just the Indian government, but for other governments that are currently drafting their privacy laws, they can look to Europe's decades of experience and expertise to draft their own. Which brings me to the third part of this story, which is what I call the Indian tech clash. Now, 20%, only 20% of India's 1.2 or 1.3 billion plus population is online. But remember that we are already one of, if not the largest market for many of these tech companies. Never mind the fact that the financial capacity of many of these users is severely restricted. The important thing is it's the data of the next billion that's up for grabs. But it isn't just big tech companies that have identified this potential. India will be data rich before it's economically rich. We were told by one of India's leading industrialists and the chief architect of Aadhaar. He argued, as several other influential voices did, why should Western companies get to exploit the data of Indian citizens without contributing back to the domestic economy? Instead, we need to take back control of personal data from these Western companies and restore that control to, well, actually, that's what's not clear. It's not clear who the control is being restored to. But there's a lot of rhetoric, so I'll take you through the two big rhetorical devices that are being used in this tech clash. The first, data colonization. Now, remember that India is still a relatively young country. We've been 70 odd years independent. And so the rhetoric of colonization is both inflammatory as it is provocative. And what we're hearing is that these Western tech companies are obviously treating India as a large untapped market, but they're not investing back into the domestic economy. So the obvious response, the argument goes, is data sovereignty or data nationalism, which is essentially about putting forth the idea that personal data of citizens should be a national resource, a public resource. So one of the officials of India's ruling party recently announced that if the BJP was elected again in the next elections, then we would see 100% data sovereignty. Now, if it isn't clear what any of this actually means in terms of policy proposals, that's kind of by design. And in fact, it is only the data protection bill that started to give us some clues about what this policy vision really meant. So this data protection bill includes a provision which says that the personal data of Indians should be stored physically in the country rather than in servers elsewhere. And so there are many reasons that folks from civil society and others have spoken up against this. They've said that this leads to easier government surveillance. The business community thinks it means increased costs. But I'd urge you to see this as part of a bigger story, which is that, and this was because very soon after the data protection bill, there was another draft policy that was leaked into the public domain, where the government argued that not only should data be localized and put in India, it should be made accessible to both the Indian government and select Indian companies. So now imagine this idea of data as a state-owned resource available to state-blessed enterprise. It might sound like a lot like out of the Chinese playbook, and for very obvious reasons, China is both an attractive and a very deeply uncomfortable example for India, which is firmly a constitutional democracy. So here we are. India's proposed data protection law is clearly, like I've explained, being pulled in these different directions, sometimes contradictory directions. So will the data protection law actually limit the kind of unchecked data extraction we've been seeing from companies and the government? Or will it simply become the foundation for a state-led vision of the digital economy, where our personal data is once again a resource for the taking? I think globally, as we're looking to governments to try and rescue us from big tech, there are important lessons here. The lesson is that we always run the risk of letting collective interest be defined simply as government interest. And and given that lawmaking processes everywhere are becoming more and more opaque and unaccountable, this is a real worry. But I don't suggest for a moment that we give up either on the government or even on law. In fact, I still believe that law is one of the most powerful instruments we have for collective action. Instead, I think the lesson here, if any, is that the citizen's voice in this debate matters more than ever. To show up to prevent the co-option of language, to kind of create a space where the battle for personal data is not reduced to a battle between and the choice between big tech and the big state. Thank you.
There's also somebody wandering around with a mic. If you want to ask questions, just raise your hand, somebody will come to you. I just ask you, don't start talking until somebody comes to you with a mic, because then nobody's going to be able to hear you. Amba.
Hello. So if the Indian government is advocating for localization of these data storage spaces in India, it's kind of assuming that just by not allowing, for example, US-based tech companies to exploit this data, it doesn't necessarily mean that Indian companies won't do that in the future, right? So it may be nationalism, but how do you guarantee that it's not the same Indian entities doing the same in the 5 years, 10 years down the line?
I couldn't have put it better myself. So that's exactly what I'm trying to say, that I think we need to prevent the term nationalism from being used to assume that it's in the interests of users, and really argue what are those protections that will protect us from all threats to privacy, whether private or government.
A lot of people in India don't have sort of national infrastructure to be able to access the internet. So Facebook are marketing to them and have restricted access. So with only 20% of currently to access the internet in India, and the government not necessarily investing in cables on the ground, how do you think that impacts the data protection? Because in a sense, can't protect the data if a completely external entity is actually providing the internet access in the first place, can you?
So, great flag, because I'm sure maybe you haven't heard, but actually when Facebook was trying to launch what they called Free Basics or internet.org and be that vehicle to provide a certain kind of internet access, the Indian government, the telecom regulator, actually came down very strongly. They said, yes, we have a huge connectivity problem. We have a very far way to go, but we don't want to make it so that we're kind of ceding this responsibility necessarily to private companies. And we want to make sure that it's not just connectivity, but what we're connecting to that matters. And I think this is a running theme in internet policy in India. In some ways, we've really been at the forefront of trying to argue that just because we have developmental challenges doesn't mean that we can argue for this kind of phasing of rights. We'll think of connectivity now, and we'll think of free speech and net neutrality and competition next. We've argued that we necessarily need to think of these issues together. And particularly on privacy, it's interesting we're having that same conversation, because not just is a small percentage of the population online, several of them are not literate and not literate in English. And so we're pushing to argue that it's not okay to just rely on the after effects of GDPR. We need a law that incentivizes people to speak to these new users who have different needs and really make consent meaningful for these populations that are coming online.
Hi, thanks a lot for the talk. I wanted to ask a little bit about something that you didn't mention, but a while ago I was following at a distance the move towards, or the push in India towards a digital infrastructure for money. And I'm wondering whether you have any comments about how this raft of new legislation relates to this kind of strong push towards cashlessness in India, and if not that specific situation, then maybe you could expand a bit on, what kind of initiatives does this framework impact on what kinds of data is at stake? Thanks.
Okay, I'll answer this question in two parts. So first, like as context to everybody else, there has been a very big push in India towards a cashless economy, and there are a lot of fintech companies that are growing in India. And the debate there is actually very similar to the one that's happening on Aadhaar. It's a question of, we won't believe that technology will make things better just because you say it's so, and we have to meet people where they are and actually ask them what's convenient to them. So yes, technology is great and moving digital is great, but to the extent that it's empowering to people. And it has created a debate around that, particularly after demonetization, when many people had very few choices and cash was in short supply. But I think it's interesting on how this conversation relates to data protection. Specifically, actually, payment companies have been mandated to store that data in India. It's been understood that payment information is extremely sensitive personal information and therefore should be put at a higher standard. So I think in general, there's a kind of worry that the fintech market is growing and it's another kind of wild, wild west of applications which we aren't sure we can trust. And the data protection law, I think, will go a long way to making sure that the ground rules for that game are set in some way, especially if we ensure that we have a good and strong law.
So, no, you've talked, so India has a number of advantages that lots of other poor countries don't. It's got a giant market that big companies are interested in and therefore will toe the line to a certain degree. It has, as you mentioned, a robust constitutional democracy, a strong civil service, a strong, strong civil society, also a strong civil service for that matter. What about lots of other poor countries that don't enjoy all these advantages? What can they learn from India as poor countries, but without these advantages?
That's a great point. I think when India, ruled against Facebook 3 Basics, we were kind of looking at how similar programs were being rolled out in large parts of Africa with little to no resistance. And the question was why? And the answer that we reached was the fact that we had a strong digital rights community and a strong civil society. But we also found that shortly after that, in the years following, we did see after effects of the Indian experience being quoted to lawmakers elsewhere and maybe giving them the kind of affirmation that it, again, like I said, it wasn't enough to just say these are developing countries, connectivity is the biggest problem, because clearly India is one of the world's largest democracy, was kind of taking a stand on internet policy and maybe even fashioning themselves as a kind of leader in internet policy. So I guess the short answer to your question is I think both with the data protection law, but more generally, India does enjoy a position of leadership, and that makes it all the more important that we get this one right.
So kind of following up on the previous question about how these tech companies are actually providing that infrastructure for the rest of the 80% of the population that doesn't have the connectivity, right? And I guess now a lot of these tech companies and even large banks have huge Bangalore offices, and because infrastructure is a big problem, they're not just supporting these connectivity infrastructure, but also roads and trains and everything. So for these local citizens who are benefiting directly from this public infrastructure, not just internet, for them they might have not a big rationale to vote against these tech companies utilizing their data, let alone say they don't have connectivity from the start. So how do you think is a good way to educate the public that these companies, although you may be seeing some direct benefits day to day, you also have to fight for your privacy and data protection?
Yeah, I don't think that anyone's trying to kind of malign tech companies for the sake of it and be like, get out of the country. I mean, there might be a few people, like I mentioned, who might feel that way, but I don't think that's where the conversation is headed. It's like elsewhere, it's just about ensuring that companies are responsible with the use of the data of Indian residents. So yes, there might be many external benefits that are coming. And to your point about how do we talk to people, I think that there's actually, it's the global mood, it's Aadhaar. That conversation is actually rapidly increasing in India. You don't even have to explain to people why we shouldn't be beholden to tech companies, but think about them more critically. I think that inflection point globally and in India is already here. Thank you so much.